Chapter 3 Biopsychology. Biopsychology explores the biological mechanisms that underlie behavior. Among many things it studies genetics, focusing on how inherited genes can affect not only physiological but psychological traits of a person, the structure and function of the nervous system, how the nervous system interacts with endocrine system. Human genetics. Studying human genetics can help researchers understand the biological basis underlying the differential behaviors, thoughts, and reactions of humans. Why do two people infected by the same disease have different outcomes? Are there genetic components to psychological disorders such as depression? How are genetic diseases passed through family lines? The theory of evolution. Charles Darwin explored the concept of inheritance of traits throughout generations in his theory of evolution through natural selection. The organisms that are better suited for their environment will survive and reproduce, while those that are poorly suited for their environment will die off. Characteristics and behaviors that impact survival and reproduction. Those that help protect against predators, those that increase access to food, those that help the offspring live. So a quote by Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. In 1859, Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection in his book On the Origin of Species. The book contains just one illustration, this diagram that's shown how species evolve over time through natural selection. Genetic variation. The genetic difference between individuals contributes to a species' adaptation in its environment and begins when an egg, containing 23 chromosomes, is fertilized by sperm containing 23 chromosomes. So a chromosome is a long strand of genetic information known as DNA. So DNA is a helix-shaped molecule made of nucleotide-based pairs, and each chromosome sequences of DNA make up genes. A gene is a sequence of DNA that controls or partially controls physical characteristics known as traits, so eye color, hair color, etc. A gene may have multiple possible variations or alleles, a specific version of a gene. A specific gene may code for hair color, and the different alleles of that gene affect what the hair color will be. Genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual based on the genetic material, DNA, inherited from parents. A phenotype describes an individual's observable characteristics, such as hair, color, skin color, height, and build. Dominant versus recessive alleles. The majority of inheritable traits are controlled by more than one gene, and in such cases they are known as polygenic traits. Some traits are controlled by one gene. Alleles can be dominant or recessive. In the example below, A is the dominant allele for the flower color purple, and A is the recessive allele for the flower color white. Possession of a dominant allele will always result in the expression of that phenotype. This could be inherited from one parent, big A, little a, or both parents, big A, big A. Phenotype of a recessive allele will only be physically expressed if the person is homozygous for that allele, meaning they inherited a recessive allele from both parents, little a, little a. Heterozygous, consisting of two different alleles, big A, little a. Homozygous, consisting of two identical alleles. So it can either be big A, or little a, little a. A Punnett square is a tool used to predict how genes will interact with the production of offspring. The capital B represents the dominant allele, and the lowercase b represents the recessive allele. In the example of the cleft chin, where big B is the cleft chin dominant allele, wherever a pair contains the dominant allele, big B, you can expect the cleft chin phenotype. You can expect a smooth chin phenotype only when there are two copies of the recessive allele, little b, little b. A cleft chin shown here is an inherited trait. In this Punnett square, big N represents the dominant allele, and little p represents the recessive allele that is associated with PKU. If two individuals mate who are both heterozygous, big N, little p, for the allele associated with PKU, their offspring have a 25% chance of expressing the PKU phenotype. Where do harmful genes like PKU come from? Some are the results of mutations. A mutation is a sudden, permanent change in a gene. Many mutations are harmful, but some can also be beneficial. Gene-environment interactions. Nature and nurture work together in complex pieces of a puzzle. The interaction of our environment and genes make us the individuals we are. There are many different ways to look at this interaction. Range of reaction asserts our genes set the boundaries within which we can operate, and our environment interacts with the genes to determine where in that range we will fall. Genetic environmental correlation view of gene-environment interactions that assert our genes affect our environment, and our environment influences the expression of our genes. Epigenetics study of gene-environment interactions, such as how the same genotype leads to different phenotypes. Cells of the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of two types of cells, neurons and glial cells. Neurons are the basic units of the nervous system, responsible for conducting nerve impulses needed for tasks associated with the nervous system, responsible for the reception, conduction, and transmission of electrochemical signals. Glial cell provides physical and metabolic support to neurons, including neuronal insulation and communication and nutrient and waste transport. So the glue outnumber neurons 10 to 1, and they include oligodendrocytes, Schwann cells, astrocytes, and microglia. Neuron structure. The function of a neuron is assigned by specific aspects of its structure. Its semi-permeable membrane allows smaller molecules or molecules without an electrical charge to pass through it, while stopping larger or highly charged molecules. Incoming electrical signals from other neurons are received by the dendrites, which then send the signal down to the axon. Axons are covered in a myelin sheath made of a fatty substance that instigates axons and allows the signal to travel down the axon quicker. At the end of the axons are terminal buttons, which contain synaptic vessels, storage sites for chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The synapse. The synapse is the space between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. This is a pseudo-colored image from a scanning electron microscope. A terminal button, green, has been opened to reveal the synaptic vessels, orange and blue, inside. Each vessel contains about 10,000 neurotransmitter molecules. Neurotransmitters from nearby neurons attach to receptors in dendrites, causing a membrane potential to change. Depolarization, the membrane potential becomes less negative, making the neuron more likely to fire. Excitation. Hyperpolarization, membrane potential becomes more negative, making the neuron less likely to fire. Inhibition. If the level of charge reaches the threshold of excitation, an action potential will occur. Ion channels open, causing big N, little a plus, to rush into the cell, and the inside of momentarily become more positive. Threshold of excitation, level of charge in the membrane that causes the neuron to become active. Action potential, an electrical signal. Action potentials act on an all or none principle. The incoming signal is either sufficient to reach the threshold of excitation or it's not. During the action potential, the electrical charge across the membrane changes dramatically. Reuptake. Once an action potential has occurred, excessive neurotransmitters in the synapse either drift away, are broken down, or are reabsorbed. Reuptake involves moving the neurotransmitters from the synapse back to the axon terminal from which it was released. Neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitter is the chemical messenger of the nervous system. Different neurons release different types of neurotransmitters that have many different functions. Biological perspective. The view that psychological disorders like depression and schizophrenia are associated with imbalances in one or more neurotransmitter systems. Acetylcholine, muscle action and memory. Beta endorphin, pain and pleasure. Dopamine, mood, sleep and learning. Norepinephrine, heart, intestines and alertness. Serotonin, mood and sleep. Drugs. Psychotropic medication. There are drugs that treat psychiatric symptoms by restoring neurotransmitter balance. Agonist. A drug that mimics or strengthens the effects of neurotransmitter. Antagonistic. A drug that blocks or impedes the normal activity of a given neurotransmitter. Agonist and antagonistic drugs are prescribed to correct neurotransmitter imbalances. So Parkinson's disease is associated with low levels of dopamine. Dopamine agnostics are often prescribed as one of the form of treatment. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is associated with too much dopamine. Many antipsychotic drugs are therefore dopamine antagonists. The nervous system is divided into two major parts: the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is made up of two different parts: somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system relays sensory and motor information to and from the CNS. Autonomic nervous system controls our internal organs and glands and can be divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system involved in stress-related activities and functions. It prepares us for fight or flight. So fight or flight response is activation of sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, allowing access to energy reserves and heightened sensory capacity so that we can fight off given threat or run away to safety. Parasympathetic nervous system associated with routine, day-to-day operations of the body under relaxed conditions. Rest and restore response relaxes the body after flight or fight, aka rest and digest. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system complement each other to maintain homeostasis, a state of equilibrium in the body. Subdivisions of the nervous system. So we have the nervous system, central and peripheral, somatic, autonomic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic. So in the parasympathetic nervous system, there's constricted pupil, stimulating salivation, slow heart rate, constricts bronchi, stimulates digestion, and causes bladder to contrast. Sympathetic nervous system dilates pupil, inhibits salivation, decreases heart rate, dilates bronchi, inhibits digestion, inhibits contraction of bladder. The brain and the spinal cord. The brain, comprised of billions of interconnected neurons and glia. Bilateral, which is two-sided, and can be separated into distinct lobes, but all areas interact with one another. The spinal cord delivers messages to and from the brain, has its own system of reflexes. The top merges with the brainstem and the bottom ends just below the ribs. Functionality organized into 30 segments, each connected to a specific part of the body through the PNS. Sensory nerves bring messages in and up to the brain. Motor nerves send messages out to the muscles and organs. In moments of survival, automatic reflexes allow motor commands to be initiated without sending signals from sensory nerves to the brain first, allowing for very quick reactions. The two hemispheres. The surface of the brain, known as the cerebral cortex, is covered with bumps and folds called gri, small grooves called sulci, and large grooves called fissures, such as the longitude fissures that divide the brain into left and right hemispheres. Lateralization, concept that each hemisphere of the brain is associated with specialized functions. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the left and right hemisphere of the brain and allows them to communicate. A scientist spreads the dissected sheep brain apart to show the corpus callosum between the hemispheres. The forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The brain and its parts can be divided into three main categories: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Forebrain structures. So the forebrain is the largest part of the brain. It contains the cerebral cortex, higher level of process, the thalamus, the sensory relay, the hypothalamus, the homeostasis, the pituitary gland, the master gland of the endocrine system, the limbic system, emotion and memory circuit. The cerebral cortex, the lobes of the brain. Cerebral cortex, surface of the brain, is associated with our highest mental capabilities, such as consciousness, thought, emotion, reasoning, language, and memory. It can be broken into 4 lobes, each with different functions. So the lobes are temporal lobe, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. The frontal lobe, involved in executive function, planning, organizing, judgment, attention, and reasoning. Motor control, emotion, and language. It contains the motor cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and the Broca's area. The motor cortex is a strip of cortex involved in planning and coordinating movement. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher-level functioning. The Broca's area is a region of the left hemisphere that is essential for language and production. Damage to the Broca area leads to difficulties producing language. Damage to the frontal lobe, Phineas Gage. While working as a railroad foreman, an accident caused an iron rod to penetrate through Gage's skull and frontal lobe. After the accident, people noticed changes in his personality. Before the accident, he was well-mannered and soft-spoken. After the accident, he started behaving in odd and inappropriate ways. These changes were consistent with the loss of impulse control, a function of the frontal lobe. Phineas Gage holds the iron rod that penetrated his skull in 1848's railroad construction accident. Gage's prefrontal cortex was severely damaged in the left hemisphere. The rod enters Gage's face on the left side, passing behind his eye, and exits through the top of his skull. The parietal lobe, involved in processing various sensory and perceptual information, contains the primary somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is essential for processing sensory information from across the body, such as touch, temperature, and pain. It's organized typographically. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing, memory, emotion, and some aspects of language. It's located on the side of the head, near the temples, and it contains the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area. The auditory cortex is a strip of cortex in the frontal lobe that is responsible for processing auditory information. Wernicke's area is important for speech comprehension. Damage to Wernicke's area results in difficulty understanding language. The occipital lobe, associated with visual processing. It contains the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting incoming visual information. It's organized retrotypically. The thalamus. The thalamus serves as the relay center of the brain, where most senses, including smell, are rerouted before directing to other areas of the brain for processing. The limbic system. The limbic system is involved in mediating emotional responses and memory. It is made up of a number of different structures, some of the most important ones being the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The amygdala involves our experience of emotion and tying emotional meaning to our memories, involved in the processing of fear. The hippocampus is a structure associated with learning and memory, in particular spatial memory. The hypothalamus regulates homeostasis processes including body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. The midbrain. The reticular formation is important in regulating the sleep-wake cycle, arousal, alertness, and motor activity. The substantia nigra, where dopamine is produced, involved in the control of movement. The ventral tegmental area, where dopamine is produced, associated with mood, reward, and addiction. Deterioration of the substantia nigra and the VTA is involved in Parkinson's disease. The hindbrain. Medulla controls automated processes like breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. Pons connects the brain and the spinal cord, involving in regulating brain activity during sleep. The cerebellum controls our balance, coordination, movement, and motor skills, and it is thought to be important in processing some types of memory. These three structures combined are known as the brainstem. These are types of brain imaging. So techniques involving radiation is the CT scan and PET scan. Techniques involving magnetic fields is the MRI and fMRI. Techniques involving electroactivity is the EEG. This involves X-rays and creates an image through X-rays passing through varied densities within the brain. A CT scan can be used to show brain tumors. The image on the left shows the healthy brain, whereas the image on the right indicates a brain tumor on the left frontal lobe. Positron emission typography scan, known as a PET scan, involves injecting individuals with a mildly radioactive substance and monitoring changes in blood flow to different regions of the brain. A PET scan is helpful for showing activity in different parts of the brain. MRI and fMRI. MRI is a magnetic resonance imaging. It's a magnetic field used to produce a picture of the tissue being imaged. An fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, MRI that is shown changing in metabolic activity over time. An EEG involves recording the electroactivity of the brain via electrodes on the scalp. Using caps with electrodes, modern EEG research can study the precise timing of overall brain activities by tracking amplitude of frequency and brain waves. The endocrine system, a series of glands that produce hormones to regulate normal body functions. The hypothalamus links to the nervous system and the endocrine system by controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland serves as the master gland controlling the secretions of all other glands. The thyroid secretes thyroxine, which regulates growth, metabolism, and appetite. The adrenal gland secretes hormones involved in the stress response. The gonad secretes sex hormones, which are important for successful reproduction and regulate sexual motivation and behavior. The pancreas secretes hormones that are regulating blood sugar. So this is it for chapter 3. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and goodbye.